Have you ever wondered what truly defines a man? Wealth, power, or the quiet choices he never speaks of? Picture this: a titan of the elite world, surrounded by flashing cameras and skyscrapers. Yet his deepest secret isn't hidden in boardrooms. It's waiting in a modest house on the outskirts of town, where a past he abandoned refuses to stay buried. This story will take you through trials of honor, twists that'll keep you guessing, and a journey to reclaim the real meaning of family. If you're ready to dive in, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. The Richuak penthouse office of Langston Properties perched atop Chicago like a crown of glass and steel, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a city ablaze with lights. Richard Langston sat alone at his desk, a slab of polished walnut that gleamed under the sterile glow of recessed bulbs. At 60, he was the picture of discipline. Silver hair swept back, suit crisp as a blade, eyes sharp enough to cut through any deal. Tonight, though, those eyes stared past the skyline, lost in something deeper than the contracts stacked before him. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9, its hands slicing through the silence. A notification pinged on his laptop, an email from his assistant Ellen, reminding him of tomorrow's real estate auction. Biggest in a decade, she'd written, her tone clipped and efficient, the way he liked it. He didn't reply. Instead, he reached for the crystal tumbler of whiskey at his elbow, the amber liquid catching the light like molten gold. One sip, then another. It burned, but it didn't warm him. He'd built this empire with his own hands. 30 years of late nights, ruthless negotiations, and choices that carved away pieces of his soul. Langston Properties wasn't just a company. It was his legacy, a testament to his control, his honor. Or so he told himself. Tonight, the weight of that legacy felt less like pride and more like a chain. His fingers brushed the edge of a drawer, hesitating before sliding it open. There, tucked beneath a stack of old memos, lay a photograph, its frame cheap and faded, its edges worn from years of neglect. He lifted it, turning it over slowly. Clara stared back at him, her chestnut hair spilling over her shoulders, her smile soft and unguarded. Beside her stood a younger Richard, his arm around her, grinning like a man who hadn't yet learned the cost of ambition. The photo was from their wedding day, a quiet affair in a clapboard chapel, with nothing but a borrowed suit and a promise to keep them warm. He'd broken that promise 25 years ago. The memory clawed at him now, Clara's voice, trembling, but fierce as she stood in their cramped apartment, begging him to stay. "We don't need more, Richard. We need you." He'd turned away, his jaw tight, his mind already on the deal that would launch his career. Victor Hargrove had been there that day, a junior partner with a smirk and a handshake, whispering that family was a luxury men like them couldn't afford. Richard had believed him. He'd walked out, leaving Clara and their son Daniel behind, like relics of a life he'd outgrown. The photo slipped from his hand, landing face down on the desk. He didn't pick it up. "I don't need anyone," he muttered to the empty room, the words a mantra he'd repeated for decades. "I never have." But the lie tasted bitter tonight, sharper than the whiskey. The lights of Chicago glittered below, countless lives, countless stories. And yet here he was, a king on a throne of glass, alone. He stood, the leather chair creaking under his weight, and crossed to the window. The city sprawled out like a map of his triumphs, the Langston Tower piercing the skyline, the waterfront condos he'd fought to build, the charity galas where he'd smiled for cameras. Every victory had been a brick in the wall he'd erected around himself, a fortress of discipline and dignity. But tonight, those lights didn't warm him. They mocked him, cold and distant, a reminder of what he'd traded away. His phone buzzed. On the desk, a text from a colleague inviting him to a late dinner with investors. "Celebrate the auction early," it read. Richard ignored it. He didn't need their laughter, their clinking glasses, their empty praise. He'd spent years perfecting the art of solitude, turning it into a shield. Yet, as he stood there, the shield felt thinner than ever, pierced by a question he couldn't silence. Was this honor? Was this the man he'd meant to become? He drained the whiskey, the burn steadying him, and grabbed his coat. a tailored wool piece that cost more than most people's rent. The elevator ride down was silent, the hum of machinery his only companion. In the parking garage, his black Bentley waited, its sleek lines a mirror to his own polished exterior. He slid into the driver's seat, the leather cool against his palms, and started the engine. He didn't plan to go anywhere specific. The auction prep could wait. The investors could wait. For once, he let instinct guide him, turning the car onto the highway that stretched beyond the city's glow. The road grew quieter as he drove, skyscrapers giving way to suburbs, then to streets lined with modest homes and flickering streetlights. He knew this route by heart, though he hadn't taken it in years. It led to Clara's old neighborhood, a place he'd buried in the past along with everything else. The dashboard clock read 9:47 when he slowed near a familiar corner. The house was still there, wooden siding weathered but proud, a single light glowing in the window. He hadn't meant to stop, hadn't meant to look, but something pulled at him, a thread of memory too strong to cut. He parked across the street, the engine idling, and stared at the house where he'd once been a husband, a father. "I don't need this," he whispered, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. But his eyes betrayed him, fixed on that light, on the life he'd left behind. He could turn back now, return to the penthouse, to the safety of his empire. Yet his hands didn't move. For the first time in decades, Richard Langston felt the cracks in his control, the stirrings of a man who'd spent too long running from himself. He cut the engine, the silence swallowing him whole. The cold night air bit at his face as he stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He didn't know what he was looking for. Forgiveness, answers, or just a glimpse of what might have been. But as he stood there, the weight of 25 years pressed down, and he knew one thing with unshakable clarity. He couldn't stay away any longer. The suburban street stretched before Richard Langston like a memory he'd tried to erase, its quiet hum a stark contrast to the restless pulse of Chicago's downtown. He stood beside his Bentley, the car's engine still warm, its black sheen catching the faint glow of a streetlight. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp grass and wood smoke, a smell that tugged at him, pulling him back to a time when life was simpler, softer. Across the road, Clara's house loomed small and unassuming, its wooden siding weathered to a muted gray. A single light burned in the window, casting a golden square onto the lawn. He shouldn't be here. Every instinct honed over decades of discipline screamed at him to get back in the car, to drive away, to bury this impulse beneath the weight of his carefully constructed world. But his feet stayed planted, his breath fogging in the cold as he stared at that light. 25 years had passed since he'd last stood on this street, since he'd turned his back on Clara and Daniel, choosing ambition over the messy, fragile bonds of family. He'd told himself it was the honorable thing, the necessary sacrifice. Now the lie felt flimsy, unraveling under the gaze of that modest house. The front door creaked open, and Richard's heart jolted. He stepped back, half hidden by the shadow of a gnarled oak, as Clara emerged. She hadn't changed much, her chestnut hair now streaked with silver, pulled into a loose bun, her frame still slight but steady, wrapped in a wool coat that looked older than the house itself. She moved with the quiet grace he remembered, the kind that had once softened his edges. But it wasn't Clara who held his attention now. It was the boy beside her. The child, maybe 10 years old, trailed behind her, his small hand clutching hers. He wore a faded jacket too big for his frame, the sleeves swallowing his wrists, and carried a wooden toy car in his free hand. Under the streetlight, his face came into view, dark hair tousled by the wind, a scattering of freckles across his nose and eyes. God, those eyes. They were Richard's eyes, sharp and gray, the same ones that had stared back at him from Daniel's face when he was a boy. The resemblance hit like a punch, stealing the air from his lungs. "Sam, careful now," Clara's voice carried across the yard, gentle but firm, as the boy bent to pick up a pebble. Sam. The name echoed in Richard's mind, unfamiliar yet piercing. He watched as Sam tossed the pebble into the grass, then turned to Clara with a grin, saying something too soft to hear. She smiled back, a real smile, not the tight-lipped one she'd worn when they fought, and ruffled his hair. "Come on, let's get inside," she said, guiding him toward the door. Richard's hand tightened around the car keys in his pocket, the metal biting into his palm. He didn't move, didn't call out. Control was his armor, and he wouldn't shed it. Not here, not now. But questions clawed at him, sharp and relentless. Who was this boy? Why did he look so much like Daniel? And why did he call Clara Grandma, as he'd just heard in that fleeting moment when the wind carried the word to him? His mind raced back to Daniel, the son he'd left at 5 years, old, a wiry kid with a gap-toothed smile and a voice that begged for bedtime stories Richard never had time to tell. The last time he'd seen him was through a rain-streaked window, Daniel's small hands pressed against the glass as Richard drove away. Clara had refused his money after that, her letters growing shorter until they stopped altogether. He'd assumed she'd moved on, built a new life. He'd never checked. It was easier that way. Cleaner. But this boy, Sam, was he Daniel's son? His grandson? The possibility lodged in his chest, heavy and unyielding. If it was true, then Daniel had grown up, had a child of his own, and Richard had missed it, all. The thought was a quiet wound, deeper than any boardroom betrayal. Yet he stood still, his face a mask of calm, his breathing even. He wouldn't storm across that lawn, wouldn't pound on her door demanding answers. That wasn't who he was. Richard Langston didn't unravel, didn't shout. He calculated, he waited, he endured. Clara paused at the doorstep, her hand on the knob, and glanced back toward the street. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Or so it seemed. Richard couldn't tell if she saw him, half shrouded by the oak, or if she was simply scanning the night. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture stiffened, a flicker of recognition or suspicion. Then she ushered Sam inside, the door clicking shut behind them. The light in the window dimmed as a curtain slid closed, leaving only the street lamp to keep him company. He exhaled, the sound harsh in the silence. His fingers loosened around the keys, the sting in his palm, a faint echo of the ache in his chest. He could leave now, return to the penthouse, to the life he'd mastered, where emotions were liabilities and honor was measured in profit margins. But his gaze lingered on that house, on the shadow of a family he'd abandoned. Clara had raised a child, maybe his grandson alone, while he'd built towers to the sky. What kind of man did that make him? "I don't need this," he murmured, the words a shield against the tide rising inside him. Yet they rang hollow, weaker than the wind rustling the leaves above. He turned toward the car, each step deliberate, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement like a metronome keeping time. But as he reached for the door handle, he stopped. The image of Sam's eyes, those gray, piercing eyes, burned. Behind his lids, a mirror to a past he couldn't outrun. He wouldn't leave. Not yet. Tomorrow, he'd face the auction, the investors, the empire he'd forged. But tonight, he'd take one step closer to the truth. He'd knock on that door. Not out of anger, not out of weakness, but because a man of honor didn't turn away from what he'd broken. The decision settled over him calm and certain as he stood beneath the streetlight, a solitary figure poised between the life he'd chosen and the one he'd lost. Richard Langston stood on Clara's porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath, his polished shoes. The night pressed close, its chill seeping through his tailored coat, but he felt none of it. His hand hovered over the door, knuckles poised, as the weight of 25 years steadied his breath. He wasn't here to demand or unravel, not yet. A man of honor faced his past with composure, not chaos, and Richard had spent decades perfecting that art. He knocked, 3 firm raps measured and calm, then stepped back, hands clasped behind him like a soldier awaiting orders. The door opened slowly, revealing Clara in the soft glow of an entryway lamp. Her face was a map of time, lines etched around her eyes, silver threading her hair, but her gaze held the same quiet strength he'd once leaned on. She didn't flinch at the sight of him, though her lips tightened, a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, or resignation, crossing her features. Behind her, the house exhaled warmth, the faint crackle of a fireplace, the aroma of coffee brewing in the kitchen, a home lived in and loved. "Richard," she said, her voice low, steady. No question, no welcome, just his name, a statement that carried the weight of decades. She didn't move to let him in, her frame filling the doorway like a guardian. "Clara," he replied, matching her tone, his voice smooth despite the storm brewing inside. "I saw you. With the boy." He paused, letting the words settle, watching her eyes for a crack in her armor. "I need to know who he is." She studied him, unblinking, then stepped aside with a slight nod. "Come in, but keep your voice down. Sam's asleep." The command was gentle but ironclad, and Richard obeyed, crossing the threshold into a world he'd abandoned. The living room was small, its walls lined with bookshelves bowing under the weight of novels and photo albums. A worn rug stretched across the floor, its edges frayed from years of footsteps. In the corner, a fireplace cast dancing shadows, its logs popping softly. An empty armchair sat beside it, its cushions sagging as if waiting for someone who never came. Richard's gaze snagged on it, a memory flashing unbidden. Clara curled there with Daniel on her lap, reading him stories while Richard pored over contracts at the kitchen table. He'd always been too busy to join them. "Sit," Clara said, gesturing to a sofa across from the hearth. She didn't offer coffee, didn't soften the moment with pleasantries. She took the armchair herself, her posture rigid, hands folded in her lap. "You've got 5 minutes. Say what you came to say." Richard sat, the sofa creaking under his weight. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gray eyes locked on hers. "The boy, Sam. He looks like Daniel. Like me. Who is he, Clara? Is he ours?" The question hung between them, heavy but delivered with the precision of a man who'd mastered control. Clara's expression didn't waver, but her fingers tightened, knuckles whitening. She drew a slow breath as if bracing herself, then spoke. "Sam is my grandson, Daniel's son." The words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper into Richard's chest. "Daniel's been gone 10 years, Richard. He died. Heart failure, sudden and quiet. Sam was 2 when it happened. I've raised him ever since." The room tilted, though Richard didn't move. Gone. Daniel, his son, the boy he'd left with a toy truck and a promise he never kept, was gone. 10 years. The math seared through him. Daniel had been 30 when he died, a man with a life, a child, a story Richard knew nothing of. Grief clawed at his throat, raw and jagged, but he swallowed it down, his face a mask of stone. He wouldn't break, not here, not in front of her. A man of dignity didn't crumble. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low, steady, though every syllable cost him. "I had a right to know." Clara's eyes flashed, a spark of fire beneath her calm. "A right?" She leaned forward, her tone cutting but controlled, no louder than a whisper. "You lost that right when you walked out, Richard, when you chose your empire over us. I begged you to stay, for Daniel, for me, but you didn't look back. I wasn't going to drag you into his death just to ease your conscience." Her words struck like a blade, precise and unforgiving, slicing through the armor he'd worn for decades. He wanted to argue, to defend the man he'd become, but the truth in her gaze silenced him. He'd made his choice. Langston Properties over late night stories, boardrooms over birthday cakes, and now Daniel was a ghost, a life snuffed out while Richard built towers to the sky. He straightened, forcing his hands to still. "And Sam?" he pressed, his voice unwavering. "You kept him from me too. Why?" Clara's jaw tightened, but her eyes softened, a flicker of something tender beneath the steel. "Sam deserved a life free of your world, your money, your cameras, your pride. I didn't want him tied to a man who'd only show up out of duty. Daniel forgave you. No, he told me so before he died. But I couldn't risk you breaking Sam's heart the way you broke his." The revelation hit harder than the news of Daniel's death. A forgiveness Richard hadn't earned, hadn't sought. His chest ached, a hollow pain that threatened to crack his composure, but he held it at bay, his breathing even, his gaze steady. "I wouldn't have broken him," he said, the words quiet but firm. "I'm not that man anymore." Clara stood, crossing to the fireplace, her back to him. "Your 5 minutes are up," she said, her voice flat. "Go home, Richard. This isn't your place." He rose, the motion deliberate, his coat rustling softly. "It's not over, Clara. I'll be back, for Sam." He didn't shout, didn't plead. His tone was a promise, rooted in the dignity he still clung to, even as grief gnawed at his edges. She didn't turn around, but her silence was answer enough. Richard stepped into the night, the door clicking shut behind him, and stood beneath the streetlight once more. Daniel was gone, Sam was real, and the honor he'd chased for decades felt like ash in his hands. Yet he walked to his car with measured steps, his resolve unbroken. A man of honor didn't run from his mistakes. He faced them no matter the cost. Richard Langston stood at the head of the conference table, the glass surface reflecting the cold gleam of the overhead lights. The boardroom of Langston Properties buzzed with tension, a dozen suits shifting in their seats, eyes darting between him and the massive screen on the wall. The headline blazed in bold, "Billionaire Langston's secret child scandal threatens empire." Below it, a grainy photo, Richard stepping out of his Bentley near Clara's house, splashed across the newsfeed, a timestamp from the night before. The whispers had begun, and they were louder than he'd expected. He adjusted his cufflinks, the motion deliberate, his face a mask of calm. At 60, he'd faced worse. Hostile takeovers, market crashes, betrayals that cut deeper than this. But this wasn't just business, this was personal, and the stakes were Sam, his grandson, a boy he'd only just met through Clara's guarded words. Richard's chest tightened at the thought, but he kept his breathing even, his voice silent. Control was his fortress, and he wouldn't let it crack. Victor Hargrove's voice cut through the room, smooth as oil, but sharp as a blade. "It's a mess, Richard," he said, leaning back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. At 52, Victor was younger, hungrier, his tailored suit screaming ambition. The press is eating it up. CEO hides illegitimate kid. Investors are spooked, and the auction's tomorrow. You've got to shut this down. Richard met his gaze unflinching. He remembered Victor from the early days, back when they were partners, when Victor's silver tongue had convinced him that family was a liability in their climb to the top. It was Victor who'd pushed him toward that first big deal, the one that cost him Clara and Daniel. "Leave the family man stuff to the suckers," Victor had said, clapping him on the shoulder as Richard signed away his life. Now, Victor sat across from him, a rival who'd turned betrayal into a career, and this scandal was his latest weapon. "I'll handle it," Richard said, his tone low, steady, betraying none of the storm inside. "It's noise, nothing more." "Noise?" Victor chuckled, a sound that grated like sandpaper. "It's a feeding frenzy. They've got photos, rumors. Someone's even digging into your ex-wife's past. You can't ignore this, not with the board watching." He glanced around, fishing for nods of agreement. A few directors shifted uncomfortably, but none spoke. Victor's smirk widened. "You've built this company on your name, Richard. Don't let it crumble because you can't face the truth." The truth. Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. He wouldn't give Victor the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. The truth wasn't some tabloid fiction. It was Daniel's death, Sam's existence, Clara's quiet sacrifice. And now this, a public assault on his dignity, orchestrated by a man who'd never known honor beyond a balance sheet. He could feel the board's eyes on him, waiting for a crack, a outburst. But Richard Langston didn't break. "I built this company on more than my name," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I built it on results. The auction will go forward, and the numbers will speak for themselves. That's all you need to care about." He turned to the screen, dismissing Victor with a flick of his gaze. Next item. The meeting dragged on. Projections, timelines, logistics, but Richard's mind was elsewhere. Victor's words gnawed at him, not because they stung, but because they endangered Sam. The press wouldn't stop at him. They'd find Clara's house, Sam's school, turning a boy's life into fodder for headlines. He pictured Sam's gray eyes, so like Daniel's, and felt a surge of something fierce. Protection, not anger. He wouldn't let Victor's games touch that child. As the boardroom emptied, Victor lingered, stepping close enough for Richard to smell his cologne. Sharp, expensive, overdone. "You can't hide forever," Victor murmured, his voice a taunt. "They'll find the kid, the mother, the whole sordid story. You're not as untouchable as you think." Richard turned, his height giving him an edge as he looked down at Victor. "You mistake me for someone who fights dirty," he said, each word measured, cold. "I don't need to stoop to your level to win, but if you go after that boy, you'll regret it, not because I'll lash out, but because I'll bury you with the truth." He held Victor's gaze until the younger man looked away, a flicker of unease breaking his bravado. Victor retreated with a scoff, but the threat lingered. Richard returned to his office, the penthouse view sprawling before him. Chicago's skyline, a kingdom he'd conquered. He sank into his chair, the leather creaking, and pulled out his phone. A missed call from Ellen, his assistant, and a voicemail. "Sir, there's a reporter asking about a Clara Brennan and a boy named Samuel. I stalled them, but they're persistent. What do you want me to say?" He didn't play it twice. Instead, he dialed Clara's number, memorized from years ago, never used until now. It rang once, twice, then her voice came through, cautious but clear. "Richard?" "Clara," he said, keeping his tone even despite the urgency. "The press knows about Sam. They're digging. I need to know he's safe." A pause, then a sigh. "He's fine. For now. But some kids at school heard the rumors. They're calling him names, pushing him around. He doesn't understand why." Richard's hand clenched around the phone, but his voice stayed steady. "I'll fix this. I won't let it touch him, or you. Not anymore." "How?" she asked, skepticism threading her words. "You can't control everything, Richard." "I don't need to control everything," he replied, standing to face the window, the city lights blurring into a haze. "I just need to protect what matters. I'll be there tonight. We'll figure it out." She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. The line went dead, leaving him with the hum of silence. He set the phone down, his reflection staring back from the glass. A man in a suit worth thousands, fighting a battle worth far more. Victor thought he'd found a weakness, but Richard saw something else. A chance to prove his honor wasn't just a title. He'd face the whispers, the flashbulbs, the lies, not with fists or fury, but with the quiet strength of a man who'd finally stopped running. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the park near Clara's house, casting long shadows across the grass. Richard Langston sat on a weathered wooden bench, its paint peeling in strips, a far cry from the polished leather of his penthouse office. In his hands, he held a small wooden toy car, hand-carved, painted red, a gift he'd picked up on impulse from a shop near the Langston Properties Tower. It was a peace offering, a bridge to Sam, and he clutched it like a lifeline as he waited. His Bentley was parked a block away, out of sight. He didn't want Clara or the boy to see it, not yet. The park was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of a lawnmower. A swing set creaked in the breeze, its chain swaying empty. Richard's suit, charcoal gray, tailored to perfection, felt out of place here, a relic of the world he'd built, now clashing with the simplicity he faced. He'd left the boardroom chaos behind, Victor's taunts and the press's prying eyes fading as he drove out of Chicago's heart. Clara's call still echoed in his mind, Sam's confusion, the taunts at school, and it had pulled him here, not with fury, but with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path and he looked up. Clara approached, her wool coat buttoned against the chill, Sam trailing beside her. The boy's jacket hung loose, his dark hair tousled, and those gray eyes, Daniel's eyes, fixed on the ground as he kicked a pebble. Clara's gaze met Richard's, steady but guarded, a silent warning in her posture. "He's had a rough day," she said, her voice low as they stopped a few feet away. Don't make it worse. Richard nodded, rising slowly from the bench. I won't, he said, his tone calm, measured. He turned to Sam, crouching slightly to meet the boy's level, though he kept his distance. Hey, Sam. I'm Richard. I heard about school. I'm sorry. Sam glanced up, his expression wary but curious. He didn't speak, just hugged his arms tighter around himself, the toy car from last night still clutched in one hand. Richard held up the red car he'd brought, offering it with an open palm. I thought you might like this. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it. The boy hesitated, then stepped forward, taking the car with a small, tentative hand. Thanks, he mumbled, turning it over in his fingers, inspecting the wheels. A faint smile tugged at his lips, and Richard felt a crack in the wall he'd built around himself, a warmth he hadn't earned but desperately wanted. Clara watched, her arms crossed, but she didn't intervene. Richard straightened, gesturing. To the bench. Mind if we sit? He asked her. She nodded, and they settled side by side, Sam wandering a few steps away to roll the cars along the edge of the path. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken years, but Richard didn't rush to fill it. He'd come to listen, to be present, not to demand. He asked about you today, Clara said finally, her voice soft but cutting. After, the kids at school started talking. Why's everyone saying I've got a rich grandpa? I didn't know what to tell him. Richard's throat tightened, but he kept his face composed, his hands resting still on his knees. What did you say? He asked, his tone even, though the answer mattered more than he'd admit. I said you were someone from a long time ago, she replied, her eyes on Sam. Someone who made mistakes. He didn't push it. But he's smart, Richard. He'll figure it out. He nodded, absorbing her words like a man taking inventory of his debts. I don't want him hurt because of me, he said, his voice low, steady. The press, the rumors, it's my mess. I'll clean it up. Clara's gaze flicked to him, sharp but not unkind. How? You can't just buy this away. I know, he said, meeting her eyes. But I can shield him. I'll figure it out, quietly my way. He paused, then added softer. I owe him that. And Daniel. At Daniel's name, Clara's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't look away. Richard took a breath, his next words careful, deliberate. I never got to take him to a game. He asked once, a baseball game, Cubs versus Cardinals. I said I was too busy. I wasn't there for him, Clara. I can't change that, but I can be here now. Sam's laughter broke the moment, a small, bright sound as he raced the two toy cars along the gravel. Richard watched, a pang of memory slicing through him. Daniel at 5, zooming a truck across their old apartment floor, begging him to play. He hadn't. Now, with Sam, he felt the weight of that failure, but also a flicker of hope. He stood, brushing off his suit, and approached the boy. Mind if I join? He asked, crouching again. Sam nodded, handing him the older car. Richard rolled it alongside the red one, mimicking Sam's motions, the gravel crunching under his knees. You're good at this, he said, keeping his voice light. Your dad was too. He loved anything with wheels. Sam looked up, curiosity sparking in those gray eyes. You knew my dad? Richard's chest ached, but he smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips. Yeah, he was my son, a long time ago. The truth slipped out, simple and unguarded, and he let it hang there, trusting Sam to take it as he would. Cool, Sam said, turning back to the cars, but his shoulders relaxed, attention easing. Richard glanced at Clara, who watched from the bench, her expression unreadable but softer than before. As the sun dipped below the trees, Clara called Sam over. Time to go, she said, standing. Sam gathered his cars, then paused, looking at Richard. Will you come back? He asked, his voice small but direct. Richard met his gaze, steady and sure. If you want me to, yeah, I'll be here. It wasn't a grand promise, just a quiet one, rooted in the dignity he was starting to reclaim. Clara didn't object, just nodded slightly as she took Sam's hand. They walked away, the boys' chatter fading into the dusk. Richard stayed by the bench, the toy car's absence a weight in his hand. He'd lost Daniel to time, but Sam was here, real, alive, a chance to be more than the man who'd walked away. He'd face Victor, the press, the world, not with rage, but with the calm strength of a man who'd found something worth protecting. The conference room at Langston Properties buzzed like a hive under siege, its glass walls trembling, with the chaos beyond. Richard Langston stood at the podium, a lone figure framed by a sea of microphones and flashing cameras. The air was thick with the hum of voices, reporters shouting questions, assistants scrambling, the board whispering in the wings. The screen. Behind him blared the latest headline, Langston's secret grandson, billionaire's past exposed. Beneath it, a photo of Sam leaving school, his small face blurred but unmistakable, twisted Richard's stomach into a knot. Yet his hands rested steady on the podium, his gray eyes cutting through the glare with a calm that belied the storm within. Victor Hargrove had orchestrated this ambush, and he stood now at the room's edge, arms crossed, a predator's grin, curling his lips. Hours earlier, he'd leaked forged documents to the press, letters claiming Sam was Richard's illegitimate son, born out of wedlock and hidden for decades. The lie was flimsy, but it didn't need to hold. It just needed to burn. Investors were pulling out of tomorrow's auction, the board was fracturing, and Victor's triumph gleamed in his eyes. "Let's see you dodge this one," he'd sneered as Richard entered, his voice a taunt meant to provoke. Richard didn't flinch. He'd faced Victor's games before, betrayals masked as partnerships, deals twisted to favor the younger man's rise. But this wasn't about contracts or profits anymore. This was about Sam, about Clara, about the family he'd failed once and wouldn't fail again. He straightened his tie, a subtle, deliberate motion, and cleared his throat. The room hushed, a predator's pause before the strike. "I'll keep this brief," he began, his voice low, steady, slicing through the din. "You've heard rumors. You've seen pictures. I'm here to give you the truth, not because I owe it to you, but because I owe it to someone else." The cameras flashed, a staccato burst of light, but Richard's gaze remained fixed, unwavering. "Samuel Brennan is my grandson. His father, Daniel Langston, was my son. Daniel died 10 years ago, heart failure, at 30. I wasn't there for him. I chose this," he gestured faintly to the room, the empire beyond the glass, "over him and his mother, Clara. That's my failure, not a scandal." A murmur rippled through the crowd, questions bubbling up, but he raised a hand, silencing them with quiet authority. "Sam is not a secret I hid. He's a boy I didn't know about until days ago. A boy raised by a woman stronger than I ever was. The lies you've read are just that, lies. I won't dignify them with a defense. I'm here to set the record straight, nothing more." Victor stepped forward, his voice cutting in like a blade. "Noble words, Richard, but they don't change. The damage. The board's calling for your head. Investors are running. You can't talk your way out of this one." His smirk widened, daring Richard to snap, to lash out. Richard turned to him, his expression granite. "I don't need to talk my way out," he said, his tone cold but controlled, each word a measured strike. "I've built this company on results, not rumors. If the board wants me gone, they'll vote. If the investors leave, I'll rebuild. But I won't let you turn a child into your weapon, Victor. That's where you miscalculated." The room stilled, Victor's grin faltering. Under the weight of Richard's calm, he didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't give Victor the chaos he craved. Instead, he stood taller, a man whose dignity didn't bend to provocation. The reporters scribbled furiously, but Richard's focus shifted as the door swung open. Clara stepped in, her wool coat draped over her arm, a leather-bound journal clutched in her hands. The crowd parted, cameras swiveling, but she moved with quiet purpose, her eyes locked on Richard. She stopped beside him, her presence a jolt he hadn't expected. "Clara," he said, his voice softening, a question in his gaze. She didn't smile, but her nod was firm. "You're not the only one who gets to speak," she said, loud enough for the mics to catch. She opened the journal, Daniel's, its pages worn and yellowed, and held it up. "This is my son's. He wrote it before he died. 1 entry's for you, Richard." Her voice trembled slightly as she read, but it held steady enough to silence the room. "Dad never came back, but I don't hate him. He gave me Mom, and that's enough. If he ever reads this, tell him I forgive him. For me, for Sam. He doesn't need to carry it." She closed the book, her eyes meeting Richard's. "I didn't tell you because I thought you'd come back out of guilt. Daniel didn't want that. Neither did I." The words struck Richard like a wave, crashing through the walls he'd built. Forgiveness, unearned, unasked for, from a son he'd lost. His throat burned, his vision blurring, but he didn't falter. He reached for Clara's hand, a brief, steady grip, then faced the crowd again. "That's the truth," he said, his voice rough but resolute. "Not a headline, not a lie. A boy lost his father. A woman raised her grandson. And I'm done running from it." The cameras erupted, questions flying, but Richard stepped back, guiding Clara away from the podium. Victor lunged forward, his voice rising. "You think this saves you? You're finished, Langston." Richard paused, turning just enough to meet Victor's glare. "I'm not here to save myself," he said, calm as steel. "I'm here to stop losing what matters. You wouldn't understand." He walked on, Clara beside him, the flashbulbs fading into a blur. Outside, in the quiet of the hallway, he stopped, the journal still in Clara's hands. "Why now?" he asked, his voice low, raw. "Because Sam deserves a grandfather who's more than a rumor," she said, her eyes steady. "And you deserve to know he forgave you." Richard nodded, the weight of Daniel's words settling into him, not a burden, but a release. He'd lost the auction, maybe the company, but he hadn't lost himself. Not this time. With a final glance at Clara, he stepped toward the exit, his resolve unshaken. The fight wasn't over, but he'd face it not with anger, but with the quiet honor of a man who'd found his way back. The living room of Clara's house glowed with the soft flicker of the fireplace, its logs snapping gently in the hearth. Richard Langston sat on the sagging armchair beside it, the one that had stood empty for years, its cushions now cradling. His frame, the scent of brewing coffee mingled with the wood smoke, a warmth that seeped into his bones, a stark contrast to the sterile chill of his penthouse. Across from him, Clara perched on the sofa, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, while Sam knelt on the rug, a spool of kite string in his lap. The quiet was fragile, a bridge built from the wreckage of yesterday's press storm, and Richard held it with the same steady grip he'd once reserved for boardroom battles. The auction was lost. Langston Properties had taken a hit, the board clamoring for his resignation after Victor's smear campaign. The headlines still screamed, but Richard had turned off his phone, leaving Ellen to field the chaos. He'd driven here instead, the Bentley replaced by a rented sedan, its plainness a deliberate step away from the life he'd known. Clara had let him in without a word, her silence neither welcoming nor hostile, just a space for him to fill. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, steady, breaking the stillness. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, gray eyes meeting hers. "For the mess, the cameras, the rumors. I didn't want it to touch Sam. Or you." Clara's gaze held his, unflinching but softer than before. "It's done," she said, her tone even, though a trace of weariness lingered. "Sam's tougher than he looks. He asked me this morning why people care so much about you. I told him it's because you're a big deal. To them, not to us." Richard's lips twitched, a faint, rueful smile. "Not anymore," he said, his hands clasping together, fingers interlocking like a man steadying himself. "The board's vote is tomorrow. They'll push me out. Victor's won that round." She tilted her head, studying him. "And you're here instead of fighting it?" He nodded, the motion slow, deliberate. "Fighting it means more headlines. More eyes on Sam. I won't drag him through that. I've lost enough. Daniel, years with you. I'm not losing him too. His voice stayed calm, but the weight of his words pressed into the room, a vow forged in the fire of his choices. Sam looked up from the kite string, his small hands pausing. Are you really my grandpa? He asked, his voice clear, direct, cutting through the adult tension like a child's unfiltered light. Richard turned to him, crouching beside the rug to meet his level. Yeah, Sam, he said, his tone gentle but firm. I am. I was your dad's dad, a long time ago. I wasn't very good at it then. I'd like to try again, if you'll let me. Sam's gray eyes, Daniel's eyes, searched his. Then he nodded, a small, serious gesture. Okay, but you gotta help me with this kite. Dad said he'd make one with me, but... He trailed off, shrugging, and returned to the string. The ache in Richard's chest deepened. A quiet wound reopened, but he didn't let it show. He picked up a pair of scissors from the coffee table, handing them to Sam with a steady hand. Your dad was right to want that, he said, his voice low, steady. I didn't make one with him either. Let's fix that now, for both of us. Clara watched, her mug still in her hands, her expression unreadable but softer, the edges of her guard melting in the firelight. She set the mug down, leaning back. You're different, she said, not a question, but an observation. Richard I knew would have fought tooth and nail to keep that company. He straightened, settling back into the armchair, the fabric worn but comforting. The Richard you knew thought honor was power, he said, his tone reflective, calm. I was wrong. It's this. He gestured faintly to the room, to Sam, to her, being here, not out there. I'm stepping away, Clara. Not just from the board, but from all of it. The suits, the spotlight. I don't need it anymore. Her brow furrowed, skepticism threading her voice. You'd give it up? Just like that? Not just like that, he said, meeting her eyes with quiet conviction. For Sam, for Daniel's memory, for a chance to be more than a name on a building. I'll sell what I can, set up something for Sam, a fund, quiet, no strings. I want him to have what I didn't give his dad. Clara didn't respond at first, her gaze drifting to the fire. Then she stood, crossing to a drawer near the bookshelves. She pulled out a spool of twine and a stack of wooden sticks, dropping them beside Sam. If you're serious about that kite, she said, her voice dry but warm, you'll need these. Don't make a mess of my rug. Richard chuckled, a rare, soft sound, and joined Sam on the floor. Together they worked, his large hands guiding Sam's smaller ones, tying knots, aligning sticks. The boys' laughter broke the quiet as a string snapped, and Richard caught, it steadying the frame with a patience he'd never known he had. Clara watched, her arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Daniel would have liked this, she said, almost to herself, her voice barely above a whisper. He always said you'd come around eventually. Richard paused, the kite half finished in his hands, Daniel's forgiveness echoing from the journal she'd read yesterday. I wish I'd heard it from him, he said, his tone steady but thick with regret. But I'll take it now, and I'll earn it. The fire crackled as they finished the kite, its diamond shape rough but sturdy. Sam held it up grinning, and Richard felt a warmth he hadn't known in decades, not from whiskey or wealth, but from this small, shared moment. Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing the armchair as she looked at him. Stay for dinner, she said, not a plea but an offer. Sam's earned it. He nodded, rising with a quiet dignity. I'd like that. As Sam darted to the kitchen, Richard lingered by the fire, the armchair no longer empty. He'd lost an empire, but he'd gained a foothold, a chance to rebuild not with money, but with the steady hands of a man who'd learned what honor truly meant. The backyard of Clara's house shimmered under the soft glow of dusk, a year removed from the night Richard first stood beneath her streetlight. It was Valentine's Day 2026, and the air carried a crisp promise of spring, mingling with the scent of pine from the trees lining the fence. Richard Langston knelt on the grass, his suit traded for a sweater and jeans, his hands steady as he helped Sam tie a paper lantern to a bamboo frame. The boy's laughter rang out, bright and unguarded, as he fumbled with the string, and Richard caught it with a quiet smile. A smile that felt more natural now than it ever had atop his Chicago empire. Clara stood nearby, her wool coat swapped for a shawl, arranging a row of lanterns along the wooden table Richard had built last summer. The table was rough-hewn, its edges sanded by his own hands, a far cry from the polished walnut of his old penthouse desk. That life was gone, Langston Properties sold off in pieces, the board's vote a distant memory, Victor Hargrove's triumph. Reduced to a footnote as his own schemes unraveled under scrutiny, Richard had walked away, not with bitterness but with a calm resolve. His wealth funneled into a trust for Sam, and a scholarship fund in Daniel's name. The headlines had faded, replaced by a quieter truth. He was no longer the billionaire, CEO, but a man rebuilding what mattered. "Hold it steady, Sam," Richard said, his voice low, steady, as he lit the candle inside their lantern. The flame flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the boy's freckled face. Daniel's face, alive again in this small, vibrant soul. Sam grinned, his gray eyes sparkling, and Richard felt a pang of gratitude, sharp and deep. He'd lost so much, decades a son. But he hadn't lost this. Clara approached, a lantern in her hands, its paper painted with Sam's wobbly drawing of a kite. "You're getting good at this," she said, her tone dry but warm, a trace of the old skepticism, softened by time. "Better than that first kite you made. It crashed in 10 seconds. Richard chuckled, the sound low and genuine, rising from a place he'd forgotten existed. "Practice makes passable," he said, standing to meet her gaze. "I had a good teacher." He nodded toward Sam, who darted off to grab another candle, his energy boundless. She smiled, a real smile, small but unguarded, and set her lantern beside his. "He's happy," she said, her voice softer now, her eyes on Sam. "That's what Daniel wanted. You're giving him that." The mention of Daniel settled over Richard like a quiet tide, no longer a wound, but a memory he could carry. "I wish I'd known him better," he said, his tone steady, reflective. "But I'm here for Sam, that's enough." Clara didn't reply, just handed him a match, her fingers brushing his, a fleeting touch that spoke more than words. They worked together, lighting the lanterns one by one, their hands moving in a rhythm born of months spent rebuilding trust. The backyard filled with light, a constellation of glowing orbs tethered to the earth, waiting to rise. Sam raced back, his arms full of candles, and plopped down beside Richard. "Miss Carter read your article in class today," Sam said, his voice bubbling with pride as he handed Richard a candle. "She said you're a hero 'cause you didn't fight back when people were mean. Is that true?" Richard paused, the match hovering over the wick. The article, a piece he'd written for the Chicago Tribune, had been a quiet reckoning, a reflection on losing an empire to find a family. It had spread further than he'd expected, touching readers who saw in it a story of dignity over power. "Not a hero," he said, lighting the candle with a steady hand. "Just a man who learned what matters. Your dad and grandma. They're the real heroes, Sam." Sam tilted his head, considering, then nodded. "Cool. Can we fly the lanterns now?" Clara laughed, a sound that warmed the night, and Richard joined her, their voices mingling as they untied the first lantern. It lifted slowly, trembling at first, then soaring into the darkening sky, a beacon of light against the stars. One by one they released the others. Sam's kite, Clara's simple white orb, Richard's unpainted frame, each a silent promise, a letting go of what was for what could be. They stood together, watching the lanterns drift, their glow fading, into the vastness above. Sam slipped his hand into Richard's, small and trusting, and Richard held it gently, his heart full in a way wealth had never achieved. Clara stood close, her shawl brushing his arm, her presence a steady anchor. They weren't a family remade in the old sense, no grand reunion, no erasing of the past, but a new one, forged in the quiet moments of kites and coffee, of firelight and forgiveness. "I'm staying," Richard said, his voice low, certain, breaking the silence as the last lantern vanished. "Here, with you two. The city's done with me and I'm done with it." Clara turned to him, her eyes searching his. "You mean that?" "I do," he said, meeting her gaze with the calm of a man who'd found his ground. "I've got a house down the street. Small, nothing fancy. I'll be here, not as a billionaire, but as me. For Sam. For whatever this is." She didn't answer with words, just nodded, a faint smile curving her lips. Sam tugged his hand, pulling him toward the table. "Come on, Grandpa, we gotta make more for next year." Grandpa. The word settled into Richard like a gift, simple and profound. He followed Sam, Clara at his side, and as they worked, the firelight from the house spilled across the yard, illuminating the path he'd chosen. He'd lost an empire, but he'd gained a legacy, not in steel and glass, but in the trust of a boy, the quiet strength of a woman, and the dignity of a man who'd stopped running. The Tribune article had ended with a line that lingered now. "Honor isn't what you keep, it's what you give away." As the stars blinked above, lanterns long gone, Richard knew he'd given it all, and in return, he'd found more than he'd ever dreamed. The lights of Chicago might still shine, but here, beneath the sky, he was home. And as the lanterns drifted into the night, their fragile light swallowed by the vast sky, he stood there, not a king of industry anymore, but a man who'd traded empires for something greater, a hand to hold, a laugh to cherish, a legacy rebuilt from ashes. It wasn't the ending he'd planned, but it was the one he'd earned, a quiet triumph of heart over pride. What would you give up for the ones you love? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched you, give it a like and subscribe. We've got more tales of courage and redemption coming your way.